Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome Mary Rodwell. She's a professional counselor, hypnotherapist, author, ufologist, researcher, and metaphysician. She's also the founder of the Australian Close Encounter Resource Network and is recognized internationally as one of Australia's leading researchers in the UFO and contact phenomenon. Mary, welcome. How you doing tonight?
Hi, Chris. Nice to speak with you.
Yes, thank you for joining us. I've been looking forward to tonight. It's going to be a fascinating show. We're going to be looking at different contact experiences, possibilities of ET interaction with different factions on Earth, and the children of our future and how they could possibly be upgrades to the current human model. But before we get to any of that, I'd love to hear what got you started down your path and doing this research.
Well, I have to say, for those that don't know anything about me, 40 years ago, I was a nurse and a midwife. And if you'd said to me that several years later, in my latter years, I would be traveling the world talking about UFOs and aliens, I'd have probably sent you to the nearest psychiatrist. So things have changed, let's put it like that. And it came because I ultimately became a counselor working in a medical practice. And from that, when I came to Australia, I continued being a counselor. And initially, it was all the usual human issues, adolescent problems, or somebody, having to deal with grief and bereavement, this kind of thing. The interesting thing, Chris, is that when people open up to you, they often talk about unusual experiences. They will, if they've lost someone really close to them, they may say, well, I feel they're around sometimes, and I get a real sense that I can feel them, or my mum's perfume is around sometimes. I feel mum's there. So there's always been a little bit of what we call the extraordinary part of human experience in everyday experiences. But about not quite 25 years ago, a gentleman walked through the door. I was in private practice, and he said, there's no support groups for this. For this, they just think you're a loony. And he explained how he was having experiences where he was aware he was being taken out on a spacecraft. He would wake up with marks on his body, shaved areas on his leg, this kind of thing. And he said, it's not just me. My partner's having experiences. The children are having experiences. Relatives won't come to the house because they think it's demons. And he said, can you help? And that really was the beginning of the journey, because fortunately, I'm one of these people that if it's weird and wonderful, I've usually got a book on it. And I happen to have picked up a couple of books a few months prior to that about this experience, which some would say coincidence, synchronicity, call it what you want. One was by Dr. John Mack, who, for those that don't know, was a former professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, writing the book about his looking at this phenomena, and he believed in the end it was real. He wrote the book Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens, and he came in as a skeptic, but was ultimately convinced that what these people were talking about was a reality. So I read that, and I also read the book Communion by Whitley Strieber, who is an experiencer, has written many books since then, Transformation, a whole range of books on his experiences. So I'd read these two books, then someone walked through the door and talks about this experience. And what happened from then is it almost exploded, because within a few weeks, somebody else walked through the door with these experiences. And you can say, well, what's the odds on that? And then as I started to read more and connect, I found more and more people everywhere, from, lawyers, doctors, nurses, social workers, farmers, housewives, children, all talking about similar kinds of experience. And then since then, it's 3,500 at least now of people who I've connected with across the globe that have had some form of encounter experience.
Now, based on your experience with these contact experiences, were most of them positive or of negative nature?
Well, to start with, it was mostly negative, because people were scared. They didn't know what these beings were interacting with them for. They would remember certain flashbacks of being perhaps on a table with procedures being done, feeling helpless. Again, not being able to talk about it was even more scary because they were afraid people would think they were crazy. So the fear was not necessarily always about what happened to them, but more about how people would judge them or that they were going crazy. What I discovered was that as you helped many of those people, their attitude to it may very well change. And ultimately, many of them will change from that fear base, the more they understand, into something that feels like a process of an evolutionary process that becomes more positive. But there's still a small percentage that have no way of judging this other than negatively. But Chris, I don't know how much you know about this or your audience, but some of that is also related to the military abductions. And that's part of the reason the most traumatized, I call them, are usually military abductions, not extraterrestrial.
What percentage would you say is actually my lab abduction?
That one's a very hard one to know. What we did do with an organization that I'm one of the co-founders, which is the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Experience and Extraordinary Research, is when we surveyed 4,200 individuals with 600 questions. What we discovered was that about 15% were still highly negative, and about 85% had ultimately not wanted this to change and were benefiting, they believe, from the experience. Of that 15%, how many were my lab? We still haven't got that kind of data, although that is something I am sure we'll look to in the future.
Now, most of the mainstream contact experiences you hear about are encounters with grays or beings of that nature. Is that what you found mostly in your regressions, or were there other types of beings?
It's a good question, Chris. And to be quite honest, that's the popular understanding is mostly it's grays or reptilians, or et cetera, et cetera. Well, actually, there's a huge range of humanoids. The greys certainly figure higher than some other species. What we discovered with the free surveys is the one that's most seen is the humanoids. After that are the greys. But the thing is with the greys, there is not just one species of grey. One lady explained to me that she knew of 165 species of grey, for example. That's without the reptilians, the lizard-like beings. There's a whole range of them. There's mantis-like beings, insect-like beings, cat, feline-type beings, crystalline beings, energy beings, light beings. The list goes on. And so the mainstream public, due to media, due to the films they've seen, primarily have this thing in their head that mostly it's the grey Zeta-type beings. And that is not the case, although they do feature in a lot of encounters.
Now, the more I, find out about the grays, the more stories I hear, the more research I do, it seems to me that they are some type of biological robots. Not all of them, but possibly a good portion of them seem like to be sort of like a hive mentality and sort of like drones. Do you find that to be true?
There are certain levels of consciousness in the Zetas or the Greys, certainly. Some do act almost like they've got a job to do, almost robotic in their responses and what have you. But the higher upgrades of Grey are highly intelligent, highly aware, and many have shown emotion, feeling, sense of humor, a whole range of things. And there is a sense too, when people talk about being visited, we're not just talking about extraterrestrial biological entities here. We're talking about interdimensional beings, extra-dimensional beings, trans-dimensional beings, and beings potentially from our future. And the Zetas, some of them at least, are said to be, and I don't know if this is true, alleged to be from our future. And the reason they're interacting with us is because they're saying you don't want to end up like us because we've lost a lot of what made us human, and they're wanting to change the future for that reason. I don't know if that's true, All I know is that many of these different intelligences, one of the biggest messages is that we've got to look after our environment, the planet. We've got to look after each other. We've got to be very careful about how we go technologically, all saying that we don't want to head in a certain direction that may end up with us being in a similar kind of situation.
Now, you're always hearing the negative stories about the reptilians or the mantis beings. I'm wondering if there are just good and bad in every alien race, or if they are just all bad reptilians or all mantis beings or evil. What have you come across in your research?
I have a real problem when people, categorically say these are good or these are bad. Because the stories that I've heard, and remember, I'm talking about many thousands now, often when they first have an interaction, they may feel they're bad because they don't understand. And then that can change into something where they're teaching me something or showing me something. From what I hear, some people have had some amazingly loving interactions with reptilians, for example, and said my interactions were not like that. A well-known researcher, Barbara Lamb, who works in a similar way to myself, told me that she went once into her house and this 7-foot reptilian being was standing there, and all he exuded was love, and she actually was embraced by this being. So I have a sense, it's exactly as you say, that they're also on a journey. Some of them prove to be more loving than others. Some have their own self-serving agenda. That many have loving interactions with the mantis beings. And one little 8-year-old boy said that's where he comes from, that his ancestors are mantis, and that when he dies, he's going back to his ancestors, which are the mantis. And he said he's been born on this planet because he can communicate with animals, and it's to teach humans how to interact with animals. So certainly his understanding of the mantis is they're part of my family, my star family, or my ancestors, for example. This I'm finding with many different types of beings. Often there's a misunderstanding until they understand more. But what I say to people is this: don't listen to other people. Go with your own experience. And what are you feeling from this being, rather than judging them as this or this? As we know, even as human beings, we can both be in a similar situation and both have a different interpretation of it depending on our state of mind and what we feel about things. It's exactly the same, I think, with these beings.
Now, do you come across people with false memories or screen memories intentionally implanted often?
False memories and screen memories, I think, are slightly different. With the screen memory, what it really means is a lot of these beings are trying not to frighten someone, particularly when they're young. They may appear as a clown or Santa Claus or an owl outside the window with big eyes, for example. And the reason for that is it's something you're familiar with, so you're not so scared. But ultimately, people have a sense that behind the clown or behind Santa Claus is something that's different and eerie or alien. So then they will have this phobia about, I can't stand clowns. Or why does that owl always, appear outside my window or whatever? When you ask them in hypnosis, Chris, to look more closely, you will find they then see the being rather than this screen memory. So I think the screen is often there as a way of protection more than anything else. The false memory syndrome, I think, is a whole new ball game, and that was brought in by the CIA and MK Ultra as a way of saying all these kinds of memories are false memories. People don't know the background to the false memory and how it was put out there. I have yet to come across someone who, when I take into a hypnosis, has not on some level resonated to what they've experienced as a reality, rather than, oh, it's just a kind of construct or whatever. I'm not saying that that cannot be done, but I think for the most part, the memories that most people have are genuine memories of what they've experienced. And Dr. Mack actually was very clear about hypnosis, because there's so much judgment about hypnosis, or, you know, people start getting their imagination and getting carried away and whatever. And there's a distinct difference between a real memory and one where it's being created. And believe me, some of the experiences that people have are so convoluted and so detailed. They've said to me afterwards, in my wildest dreams, I wouldn't have created something like this, because it's too darn weird for a start. And what Dr. Max said about hypnosis was, because we allow the subconscious, who tapes everything that we experience without editing, that actually has more integrity than conscious memory, because we're inclined to edit conscious memory to fit our paradigm, whereas the subconscious doesn't do any editing at all. So in fact, hypnosis has more integrity, not less. And that's what a lot of people don't understand.
What would you say are some of the most important recurring themes in the research and regressions that you've done?
Oh, there's a huge, a lot of patterns, I call, of the whole thing to do with hypnosis. What I've discovered is that once people open up to their experiences, you can find out a great deal more of what's going on within that space if the person is ready for it. So you can go in not just seeing the scene, maybe they've been taken to a spacecraft. One of the interesting things that I ask in hypnosis, if they're seeing 2 or 3 beings, they're having a procedure done, they want to know what the procedure is, they want to know who these beings are. And I will say to them, are any of these beings looking familiar to you? And there's always one that does. And so I'll say to them, so ask that being how many times they've picked you up. And they will reel off 2, 5, 7, da 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 da. They will just reel them off, just like that. So plainly, on some level, they have awareness of that, but they can also dialogue with them and say, look, what's this for? Why have you picked me up this time? What's it about? And what I've discovered is that the patterns are people go on spacecraft to learn things. They're being taught about the origin of the species. They're taught about cosmology. They're taught about using their psychic abilities. These are all being taught on craft, or they're taken to somewhere else to learn it, on other planets, etc., etc. That is a classic pattern. I call it space school, where they'll go from a young child. They will have downloads of information from physics, etc., etc., everything to do with energy. One young 8-year-old told me that she learned how to levitate and also to use her third eye, for example, by these beings. These are classic in terms of some of the interactions. They have healing procedures. We found with our survey with the Free organization that 50% of those who had experiences had healing experiences on board craft. So they're bringing you up if they think there's something wrong, and they will actually do various procedures so that you're actually healed. And there's been some profound healings done. Preston Dennett, one of the researchers, has written a couple of books on UFO healings, some startling stories. And in the book, Beyond UFOs, with the Free organization, there's a whole chapter on healing, for example. So healings are a very common pattern on there. People don't know this. The other thing is they're introduced sometimes to their hybrid children. That's another part of, there's a very classic pattern where people have had genetic material taken, whether it's sperm, whether it's ova, or the woman's had missing pregnancies, and then they're taken up on board craft and they're introduced to their hybrid children. And this is a lot more common than people realize, and very profound. And some of the stories that I'm talking about now, where, you know, the mother who's had this happen to her has seen her 6-year-old human daughter on board spacecraft playing with a hybrid daughter, which is part human, part feline. And they're actually playing together on board craft. So there's so much more that is going on than the average person realizes until they start to explore it. And when you explore it through hypnosis, a whole new level of interaction is actually going on.
Yeah, I definitely want to get to the hybrid aspect of it. Before that, I'd like to know, are most of these experiences, are they physical or are they non-physical? And I'd like you to explain the non-physical a little bit, because I find that one, people don't take it seriously like they should, and it's just as much of a profound and real experience as the physical.
It's a good question, Chris, and you're absolutely right. And that's been the problem with nuts and bolts ufologists, because unless it's very physical and it's tangible and you can take a picture of it or other people have seen it, they're inclined to just dismiss it. What we discovered with our survey was that 25% of these experiences are physical, 75% is non-physical. So in other words, you go out of body to the craft and have experiences out of body. And that's really crucial, because we're only just coming to an understanding of what is consciousness when people talk about near-death experiences and having that experience and actually having it validated as a very real experience. More and more people talk about astral travel. Remote viewing, again, is all about consciousness. So there's enough out there to give you the clue that this is a tangible reality, but it's still very hard for people to get a handle on. And the problem has been with ufology is that, you know, the experiencer has not been believed, and because they want them to bring a piece of the craft back with them, you know, or a little bit, or, you know, my friend E.T. And this is not how it works. So many times the experience will be in an out-of-body state, and the out-of-body state may very well be a bright orb. Because what I've discovered is that the orbs that we see, and many people see, as well as, you know, we film them, etc., are often spirits out of body or us out of body. And I've done a regression where that was absolutely proved to me with a researcher whose partner couldn't understand why the room was filled with this orb, and he couldn't wake his partner up. And we discovered the reason he couldn't wake her up was because she was the orb flying around the room, and it scared the living daylights out of him at the time, I have to say. Since then, I've heard many people explain that that's what they look like. And one of them, and this is a bit more of the weird stuff, Chris, this is why I'm so convinced that in many cases the orbs, you know, are spirits or are cells out of body. This young woman told me that she saw herself on a spacecraft, but she wasn't in her physical body. She had been moved into an ET body as a scientist. She said, I'm a scientist on board craft, and I'm in a grey body, and I have work to do. So I said, so how do you get back to your human body? And she said, she described herself, or her essence, soul, spirit, moving from the grey container and moving over as a ball of light and re-inhabiting her physical body. So that was her essence and her consciousness moving back into her physical container again. And this is what I'm discovering more and more of people are understanding in an out-of-body state. We're a ball of light. We're a ball of consciousness. Metaphysicians call it the Merkaba, you know, our light body, if you like. There's lots of different names, but many of the orbs, certainly, I believe, are spirits.
Now, one of the things that is physical evidence that we have is implants that people get, and some, you know, markings or things like that. With those, what do you think the purposes of some of the implants are?
Oh, that's a big one. Because some of them are very tangible, very real. And Dr. Roger Leir was the pioneer there, who was a good friend of mine. And as a doctor, he removed, I think, before he died a few years ago, I think he'd moved about 15 of them. Some of them were silicon, some of them were metallic. What he found was that there were lots of strange anomalies with them, highly magnetized. Some of them were, he wrote the book, The Aliens and the Scalpel, where he describes the ones that he has removed. Some of them were biological and moved. The way that people interpret that can be depending on their experiences. Some believe some of the implants are actually from the military, the My Lab, and they've been tagged by My Lab as well. Others believe they come from the craft, but not necessarily negative. One young lady who I write about in both my books, Tracy Taylor, said that she's got an implant in her arm and it helps her with her drawings. It actually enables her to, it assists her in what she's trying to produce in an artwork or whatever. So we've also got, I believe, energetic implants, which are like programs, energetic programs. So those, depending on what the person feels about them, whether they feel they're positive or negative, can actually move those off during hypnosis. You can actually find out what they're there for, and you can get them to release them. It's a bit different with the more solid ones, and that one is many people have seen that in themselves or felt they've got one. It could be in the ear, it could be in the nose. The thing is isolating is what's its purpose. Is its purpose, negative for you or positive, and who put it there and why did they put it there? So that's a whole new ball game, depending on what it is.
When it comes to the military abductions, what do you think is going on there? What do you think is some of the purposes that they are doing this?
Very good question. There's a very good book called My Lab by Dr. Helmut Lemmer. I think he's Austrian. He wrote it in the 90s, and it's not a very big book, but he goes into the My Lab quite deeply. And what he's saying is there are several agendas for picking people up and abducting them, making them think it's ET related some of the time, and traumatizing them and whatever. They want to know what that person knows about the ETs by their experiences on board craft. So they're gathering data. They want to know agendas. They want to know what they're learning, all that kind of stuff. So they're taking as much information about their interactions with the ETs as possible. But they're also wanting to make sure that they don't talk about it. So they traumatize them and make it so difficult for the person ultimately to talk about it through the abuse and what have you. And there's a lot of people I know that are experiencers that have had My Lab and have been heavily, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. One of the ladies that wrote about this, because she ended up having flashbacks, she was in the army herself and got and had My Lab experiences which were highly traumatic, Niara Isley, and she wrote Facing the Shadow, Embracing the Light. And in it, she talks about all her My Lab taken underground by these covert military organizations, and how she was traumatized and abused, drugged, etc., etc. It's a dark, dark story. And a lot of people, of course, will not want to believe our own military would ever do that to another human. Well, I'm afraid you've got to wake up and smell the roses, because it's true. And it's happening not just in America, but it's happening in many other countries as well, because there is this secret or other government, if you like, that really, I believe, is controlling a lot more than people realize. And in it, they're deciding what the narrative has to be. And if they can make you scared of the ETs, whether or not they're benevolent or not, they'll do so. And the whole idea is to scare people so much that they compromise that other agenda that may be for our benefit.
Now, speaking of the shadow government and secret factions, you always hear researchers that say that they're actually working with the malevolent extraterrestrials. Is that something that you think is actually happening?
Look, I can't dismiss anything as a researcher because I don't know what I don't know. Certainly, that is certainly plausible. And there may be some of these beings that I believe can be self-serving in terms of it suits their purpose or whatever. But I do know also, and you may be aware, Chris, I'm not sure, that they've also produced programmed life forms. By that I mean they have cloned some of these intelligences, certainly some of the greys, reptilians, and these are programmed by our military. They're not really ETs. And people will see those in these bases and believe that they're the real deal. Well, they're not. They're actually programmed life forms. Also, I did a significant regression with a lady where she remembers lying on a table and this huge mantis form was projected at her. And she said they kept saying, this is evil, this is evil, this is evil. And she said they were trying to program me to believe the mantis were evil. So we've got a really dark agenda here that is trying to act as a propaganda against many of these intelligences, because it suits whoever it is that we will feel that way and we will be in fear.
Another recurring theme that I come across with people I interview and researchers is that there is some sort of hybrid program that's ongoing. And when you look back at human history, there was a point when our DNA was all of a sudden upgraded overnight. So this has apparently been going on for a long time. What do you think they're doing now with this hybrid program?
Well, you're absolutely right, Chris. I agree with you and believe from my research exactly the same thing, that we're actually a hybrid species, that the understanding is the so-called gods and all the mythology about the gods visiting and whatever were actually ETs, and they were doing genetic engineering with the resident hominid there. And you're quite right. The evidence talks about a missing link, and suddenly we're upgraded with twice the brain size Homo sapiens, and we have their DNA. So people say to me, so why are they interested in us? That's why they're interested in us, because we're part of them for a start. But what I think has been happening is, because they've been watching our evolution over the centuries and whatever, and we've reached a very dangerous part in our technology. Why are people seeing more craft than ever before? Why are more and more people experiencing encounters and whatever? I believe it's because they're very worried about where humanity is going with the technology and what we can do to destroy ourselves and destroy our planet. So I believe there's a rapid upgrade of in our consciousness at the moment, so we don't do exactly that and end up destroying this planet, or certainly destroying ourselves in the process. So I feel that there is some kind of agendas from multiple different intelligence, because we know some of them are working together for sure. You can go on a craft with someone and they'll see a mantis, they'll see a grey, they may see several humanoids all working together, and the mantis are the master geneticists. They're the ones that do a lot of the genetic alterations and what have you anyway, and they talk about them being right across the universe, that they're actually seeding other planets all the time. They're doing this everywhere in our universes, not just planet Earth. It's what they do. They're seeding other planets, etc., and seeing how different genetics, different mixes actually work and what happens with them. So in terms of this whole hybridization, what I think is happening, it's becoming more obvious now where they're doing different programs. And we've got, these labels we're giving to the new generation, such as indigo, crystal, children of light. And then we've got the less positive labels like ADHD, dyslexia, some forms of Asperger's, autism and whatever. I believe they're all in the same pocket. They're all in the same group. It's just that one is appearing more dysfunctional. What is really going on, I believe, with these new programs is these children are different. And why are they different? Because they sense more than the 3D human up to date. They've got more awareness of what's going on. And we need to have that. We need to understand more of our multidimensional self if we're to change society and to change the way we live and to look at everything in a new consciousness of everything is sentient in some form or another, and that we're supposed to connect with that consciousness rather than think we're the superior ones and everything else is of no regard.
Now, what are your thoughts on that? The autism is actually being caused by the vaccines and some of the environmental factors that we face today. What you're saying is very interesting. I just hear that so much that it's such a bad thing. Autism is always referred to as such a bad thing, and it's being caused by these vaccines. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good cover-up for the ones that are truly being born autistic. against the ones that are being created chemically through the vaccines. That's a whole new ball game, and it's an insidious one. It's a way of shutting down a lot of those new aware souls that are coming in. It's a very good way to chemically interfere with that. But there are those that are born, or just like the Asperger's and what have you. There are a new model. And what gave me a clue with the ADHD was I couldn't understand, knowing that this is intergenerational, that every generation was being upgraded after contact to become more aware. Then all of a sudden I'd have parents with a child who was diagnosed as ADHD or Asperger's. And I kept thinking, so why would this be? Surely that's not an upgrade, is it? And when I talked to a gentleman in his mid-years, he said, Mary, I didn't know until now that I'm actually would be diagnosed as ADHD. And he said, I only know that I saw reality different to everybody else. I saw a complexity of reality that nobody else seemed to see. And he said, and I could make sense of it. And he said, so really, my ADHD enabled me to have a far broader, multidimensional vision that other people didn't seem to get. And so he wrote the book Close Encounters of the ADHD Kind, but he talked about, and he retranslates that into always dialed into higher dimensions. So ADHD is not a dysfunction. It is a new program for humans where they're wired differently. And one of them is to stop them being programmed into the old model of reality, which is inaccurate. We all know that 3D is not the truth of our reality. It is only one part of our reality. You know, we are actually all multidimensional. We all can sense, feel, have intuition, pick up things, see things perhaps that other people can't see. We all have that ability. We call it psychic ability. But in fact, it's not paranormal. It's actually the true nature of what we are.
Another aspect of this I find fascinating is the children that remember amazing details about past lives or lives on other planets. Just amazing details that you would never think that they could just make this up.
Well, that was why it was so compelling for me, because it's one thing for an adult saying, oh, I remember my past lives, or et cetera, and that can be compelling. And I've taken people in regression where they've remembered past lives through hypnosis. But when you've got a child, anything 5, 6 years old, 8, 9, 10 years old, describing where they came from, what planet they came from, what they looked like, their relationship with the different people on that planet who they say have now incarnated into this one. I mean, I was talking to a 10-year-old recently who told me this is his first Earth incarnation, and that the planet he came from, he was a blue being. He actually drew the blue being with symbols, which he explained to me, and said, I've come to this planet with a mission to help with the pollution on this planet. He remembers coming into his mother's uterus and making the decision to do so. Now, this is detail that you don't expect with children of that age. And the mere fact that it is so compelling. I've written many stories like this in The New Human. And I remember one young man telling me, I was actually speaking to his dad in the US, and he said, can I speak to Mary? Now, this is a 9-year-old, very confidently saying, can I talk to you? And I said, what is it you want to tell me? And he said, I said, why do you want to talk to me? And he said, well, it's because of your frequency. And then he said, my last life, I was on Orion. I was a light physicist, and I worked with time travel technology. And he said, unfortunately, they're very behind here on this planet. He didn't have a good word to say about the scientists here and present physics, and explained that the nearest to what he understood was Nikola Tesla. Now, this is a 9-year-old instigating a chat with me because he felt obviously I would understand, and then telling me that. Now, what child does that in normal circumstances? The mere situation itself is unusual, but he is not the only one that I've spoken to. I've talked to other children, 8 or 9 years old, that talked about going on spacecraft, being taken to planets, being shown how to use their abilities, being taught things, and they will go into detail. I've even been told by one 8-year-old when I asked what he learned, and he said, oh, it's so complex, he said. So I said, can you tell me, some of the complex stuff? And he said, no, it's too complex for you. Now, you don't expect to hear that from an 8-year-old who's telling you that what he's learning is too complex for you to understand. Now, this is what I mean. These are things that you couldn't make up if you tried.
Now, are you finding, you mentioned that some of them are coming in knowing their mission, knowing what they have to do in this life. Is that something that you find a lot often, that these children are choosing the life that they're going to live and their mission and goals?
Certainly, some of them remember literally that. I remember one 9-year-old telling me that he was describing the spirit as a will-o'-the-wisp. He said, and then I looked through the lives that I could choose, and I chose this one. He said, and then I found myself in Mummy's tummy. So he described the process of incarnating exactly. And he even explained why he chose his mother and what she had to offer him in terms of supporting him in this life. Now, this is extremely fascinating that they have that kind of memory. They have memory, as I say. Some will talk about coming from another, a different kind of water planet, for example. One young man was talking about him coming from a water planet, and then actually saying to his grandparents, and you were there too, and saying, but that time you were in this form, you weren't in that form, or whatever. So they can relate to people around them sometimes as coming from a similar place. A crystal, one was a crystalline planet, for example, where the young girl remembers one of her family being there with her on this crystalline planet and going into detail about it, and then saying, I chose to come here, and even understanding, some of them saying, this is my first lifetime on Earth, or whatever. So it's detail that you'd expect an adult to understand and to mention, but certainly not a child under 10. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. How long do you think these children have been actually incarnating here?
Well, I think there's been a progressive, it's been progressive, because I've talked to people in their 80s that have had experiences, for example, but saying that they've never been able to talk about their experiences, etc., because of the generation that they came from. I suspect that there's been some process of evolutionary shifting going on probably for millennia, but I think what's gone on now is that that's speeded up, that because of where we're at technologically, as well as intellectually with our civilization. So I think it's just more obvious now. In previous times, they would have been seen as witches, or they would have been seen as healers, or they would have been seen as alchemists, or whatever would be the ones. And I'm certain people like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, and Tesla were certainly those that had interactions and were given information. And probably many, many others that we saw as geniuses or inventors were actually given help by these intelligences to help us move forward in an evolutionary way. I'm pretty certain that would be the case.
Now, are some of these children, do they have any special abilities? You talked about that they were, receiving some sort of training when they would be taken on these ships. What kind of abilities do you think these children will have?
There's a whole range of them, from having telepathic abilities. I know, I remember one young man telling me that he was telepathic with his sister until he was about 6, until she said, don't be lazy, start talking, because they used to have this connection. And a lot of the youngsters seem to have the telepathic abilities. I remember a 13-year-old telling me that in the classroom, she found it very difficult sometimes, because she said what the teacher was saying and what the teacher was thinking were two different things. And sometimes what the teacher was thinking wasn't very nice. So telepathy is one of them. They sense energy. They will see energy. They may see even emotions in different colors. As one little 6-year-old described the different colors when mum was happy, when mum was sad. They'll see orbs of light. They may see spirits, energy beings, all sorts, even fairies, elementals, all sorts of non-physical intelligences as well. They will see, of course, craft and the different beings, and the ones they call their special friends, that would often be interpreted as imaginary friends, where in fact they're not imaginary. They're just not seen by the rest of us, because most of us only see 1% of the visual spectrum. There's a whole range of the visual spectrum that many of them are more sensitive to. They also have an ability to hear more frequencies than the rest of us. So all their physical senses are heightened. That's why many of them are so sensitive when they go to school, and react in the way they do. They will pick up your emotions. They'll pick up your feelings. And for a while, they may think they're theirs, so that they can be quite confused for a while till they understand the difference. A lot of them are aware they can remote view. They are aware they can go out of body, for example. So there's a whole range of what we see as the paranormal or psychic abilities. They will have them, but they also have an awareness of what to do with them, where the rest of us, when this starts to happen to us, we often say, oh my goodness, this is scary. What's real and what's not real anymore. And that's the problem with society at the moment, is that it's shut down from its multidimensional awareness, because we're so afraid of being seen as crazy or different, something wrong with you, or you're just imagining or whatever. So because of that, we don't own our own abilities and our own awareness. And many people come to me as they're having encounters, and they're opening up intuitively. They start to see things, they start to see beings, they start having interactions, and they're scared, because they're afraid that if they tell people this, that the first thing they're going to say is you need to see a psychiatrist, or you should take some medication or whatever. So there's this big fear that I'm going to go crazy if I open up to this awareness, when in fact it's our natural state. And this is what the beings are trying to do, is to get us to now open up to that part of ourselves that we need to, if we are going to interact healthily with these intelligences who are part of us.
Are there certain bloodlines that experience contact experiences and abductions more than others?
All I know is that a high percentage of those that have Rh negative blood a lot of them seem to have encounter experiences. I'm not saying that all the other bloodline, the different types of blood groups don't have them, because of course they do. But that seems to be a significant one because it's so different. And there is, interestingly, I think it's in Europe, I think it's the Basque population particularly have a high percentage of the Rh negative. What the Rh negative is saying to us, I think, and this is my own view and some others, that it's more of the added genetic mix that we have, and that is why it's incompatible often with all the other Rh positives and whatever, because it's coming from somewhere else. So that's as much as I know at the moment. I would love to have more understanding about how we're going to know more about the DNA and where we can identify the anomalous parts of our DNA. And I think that probably the military already know, but the rest of us are kept in the dark, just like everything else. But there is no doubt that it's linked, I think, to some of our additions to our DNA.
Now, right now, there are a lot of interesting things happening with disclosure overall. The leaks from the military, all the sightings around the world, and actually people acknowledging that the phenomenon is real. What are your thoughts on the whole disclosure movement right now and where it's going? Do you think that we will see full admittance or disclosure coming from our own government anytime soon?
It's a good question, and certainly it's heartening to finally get a bit of the drip feed, and I call it the drip feed, of getting people to realize now that at least they're talking about UAPs, in other words, UFOs, which is unidentified aerial phenomena now, the fancy name for UFOs. The bottom line is that they're admitting that they don't know what, well, they're saying that they're real. They're not saying, but they're also saying they don't know what they are, when of course they jolly well do. But it's interesting that that's been picked up by the media, and all of a sudden there's all this fantastic, oh, isn't this amazing, and all the rest of it, where the rest of us are going yawn, 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 because we know full well you've known about this for the last 80, 90 years. So it's a bit of a joke, really, but at least it's a start. I believe real disclosure will come from the people having the experiences, because more and more people are writing books about their experiences. We're having more and more investigation into the whole area of consciousness now. There's a real shift of people understanding that we are far more than our physical body, for example, this kind of thing. So I think the disclosure is going to be from the ground up, to be honest, where we're going to get more and more credible people saying, yes, this is my experience. I mean, I've met PhDs, physicists, lawyers, doctors, nurses, social workers, right across the social scale that have had experiences. And for some peculiar reason, and we both know why, unless you've got a PhD or you've got some kind of credentials, you're not likely to be believed, because, you know, you're not intelligent enough to know what your experience is, which is such an arrogant and patronizing attitude, but it's unfortunately part of the 3D. I think it's going to happen faster and faster, because I've got a feeling that they're aware something's going to happen. And the reason they're doing the drip feed is we better start putting some of this out there now. But I am sure it's because they're being pushed in some way, because I can't see any other reason for it, because they've got too much to lose in many, many ways for that. But I think it's going to come from the ground up. I think it's going to be exponential. In looking at 5 years ago to what you can talk about now, the media are no longer laughing. They're no longer having the little snigger and, you know, all the little green men type stuff. It's being taken seriously now. So I think it's watch this space, to be honest.
Now, there are some researchers that I've spoken with that think the hybrid program is of a negative nature, that they're trying to, I guess, get rid of some human emotions that we have, and just replace us overall with these new models. But according to them, you know, it's of malevolent nature, and they're trying to eliminate human emotions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, you know, this business of the hybrids taking over the planet, we've already taken over the planet, because we're all hybrids. So that really doesn't kind of gel. What I am seeing is more that we are becoming more aware, more multidimensionally aware, not less. We're not becoming limited, we're actually expanding. So there's less chance of you being, you know, being taken over when you're an expanded human. Let me give you one example of a 7-year-old that spoke to me. And he said to me, you know, I can tell when someone's lying and when someone's telling the truth. And I said to the 7-year-old, so what does that feel like? And he said, well, if they're lying, I just go all cold. And when they tell the truth, I'm warm. So this is a child of 7 that can look at you and know what you're speaking about is either the truth or you're lying. Now, he's just one that can actually discern that. Imagine what we're going to get when more and more of these young souls come in, like him, hearing stuff go on and saying, well, that's not right for a start. That's not the truth, whatever. Taking over the world will be, in my sense, it's an evolutionary shift in consciousness that's going to shift this world. And to be quite honest, we need it. Because at the moment, what we've got running the show is who's the biggest and the best and has got the most artillery. You know, that's not exactly in humanity's interest, I don't believe. And I don't believe most people want that. I think most of us would like to live in harmony with one another and all of us be able to feed our families, all of us, you know, have a stake in this beautiful planet and whatever. That's certainly not about each one of us wanting to control everybody else. That's what we've got at the moment. So anything that shifts that, as far as I'm concerned, I'm for it. And this whole business of taking over, well, we have been taken over, and it's been about power and greed and self-serving and whatever. That's already in place. Let's see if we can change that, and whatever can change that in these new upgraded humans, I'm all for.
And that aligns with many that say we are headed into a new era. I do see many people that are awakening to everything that's going on now. With these children coming in, where do you see us going, say, the next 10, 20 years in the future? Do you see a much better place than we're at now?
Well, interestingly, Chris, I've been listening to many of not only the children, but the young adults and the other generations. And I ask, what's your sense of our future from your connection to the beings? Because some of them communicate with them, they have downloads and whatever. What's your sense? And many of them sense there's going to be some significant changes. And some have called it an event. They say, almost like we're running out of time, that we've really got lots to do. There's a real sense of urgency and what have you, which makes me think that it's something sooner rather than later that's going to change on this planet. But ultimately, all of them seem to think that when we get past this, darker time where there's going to be all these shifts, that we're going into a whole new kind of era. And I'll quote someone who I have so much respect for, always have done, and that was Command Sergeant Robert Dean, who died a few years ago, who I met a number of times. And if anyone had integrity and was authentic, it was Bob Dean. And I remember recently, before he died, saying he'd been up on the craft and admitted he was an experiencer, and he'd been up there several weeks, and he said that they were telling him about the changes on planet Earth. And they said, it's going to be difficult for a while. There's going to be a lot of chaos and whatever. But ultimately, they showed him our future. And he said, and our future is magnificent, was his words. It was, and he said, it is going to be absolutely amazing. Do you know what? I'm going to hang on to that one, because I've always felt that he had absolute integrity, and that was what he came out with. And the feeling is, for me, is the reason we've all come here, why these new kids have come in. They've come in with abilities to help change the planet. I don't think they'd bother if it was a waste of time.
Very good. And I think that's a perfect note to end tonight on. Mary, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. That was fascinating information, and I'm definitely going to have you back on in the future.
Chris, it's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for your insightful questions.
All right. Thank you so much. You have a great night.
Take care. Bye-bye.